The consciousness that returned to you did not come gently. It was dragged back by violence, a convulsive, wrenching cough that seemed to originate not in your throat, but deep within the cage of your ribs, as if something were trying to turn your lungs inside out. You gasped, and the air you pulled in was a physical affront, warm, thick, and layered with odors, damp earth, moldering straw, wood smoke, and beneath it all, a cloying, rotten sweet scent that made your new stomach lurch. Your hands flew to your neck, a reflexive gesture of panic, but the fingers that touched your skin were alien. Slender. Delicate. The nails were short, ragged, and rimmed with grime. A cold, sharp terror, utterly different from any anxiety you'd ever known, pierced through the fog of disorientation. This is not my body. The thought was clear and horrifying. You opened your eyes. You were lying on a crude pallet of coarse, musty straw, the sharp ends prickling through the thin wool of your shift. Above you, the ceiling was a vault of dark, damp stone, weeping moisture in the chill. A single, small, shuttered window high on the wall allowed only a sliver of ghastly gray light to cut through the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust and decay. You tried to sit up, and a wave of weakness and unfamiliar ache washed over you. As you moved, a heavy, unpleasant weight slid over your shoulder, a thick, matted braid of hair, its color indiscernible in the poor light, smelling of old sweat and smoke. You stared at it, this foreign appendage, as the reality of your situation began to dawn. Then, the sounds penetrated. First, the deep, sonorous, and utterly mournful toll of a large bell. Dong! 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 It vibrated through the stone floor, through your very bones. Each strike felt like a nail in a coffin. Before the echoes faded, a ragged, desperate shout, much closer, sliced through the heavy air, "Bring out your dead. For God's pity, bring out your dead." This was now your face. The disconnect between your inner self and this external image was so profound it induced a wave of vertigo. As you stared, the death cart men finished their work. One of them glanced up, his eyes meeting yours through the gap in the shutter. There was no curiosity, no sympathy in that glance. Only a profound, bone-deep weariness, and perhaps a flicker of resentment. You are still alive, and I have to do this. He looked away, took the cart's shaft, and he and his partner began to pull it down the alley, its wheels sinking into the mud with a sickening squelch. The bell tolled again, a final, dreadful punctuation to the scene. You sank back from the window, your back pressing against the cold stone wall. The reality was no longer an abstract nightmare. It was here, in the mud, in the painted cross, in the face in the puddle. You were trapped in a dying city, in a dead woman's life, with a death sentence hanging over every soul, including your own. A low, involuntary sob escaped your lips, a sound that was entirely Elara's, yet fueled by your own bottomless despair. Purpose did not erase fear, but it gave it a direction. Staying in this room meant waiting for hunger, or the plague, or the men with the cart to claim you. You had to move. The ledger's command, "Live," required action. You dressed quickly, layering the spare wool dress over your shift. It hung loosely on Elara's underfed frame. You wrapped the shawl around your shoulders and head, a meager shield against the cold and the prying eyes of disease. The 3 pennies you tied into a knot in the corner of your shift, safety pinned with the second needle. The first needle remained in your bodice, a tiny lance. You placed the scrap of hard cheese and the cleaned bread into a fold of your shawl. The vinegar bottle from the apothecary and the lavender you had yet to acquire existed only as a future hope in your plan. You stood before the room's door, a thick slab of oak, banded with iron. It was the barrier between the private hell of this chamber and the public hell of the city. You pressed your ear against the cold wood. Silence from the stairwell beyond. You imagined the rest of the building, other tenants, likely dead or fled. Elara's memory confirmed it, the sounds of coughing and weeping from neighboring rooms had ceased days ago. Your hand closed around the heavy iron latch. It was stiff with disuse. You took a deep breath of the foul room air, as if it were preferable to what lay outside, and lifted. The mechanism clunked loudly in the silence, making you wince. You pulled the door inward just a crack. The stairwell was a dark throat descending into blackness. A faint, even fouler smell wafted up from below, the unmistakable odor of stagnant sewage. The steps were steep, uneven stones, worn smooth in the centers. You descended slowly, one hand trailing the damp wall for balance. Each step echoed faintly, an announcement of your movement. At the bottom, another door, this one unlocked, led to the building's entrance hall, a small, muddy space littered with trash. The words unlocked a floodgate in your mind, but the memories that surged forth were not yours. They were vivid, emotional, and utterly foreign. A name surfaced first, clinging to your new identity like a burr, Elara. You were Elara. A widow. Your husband. Tomas. His face, kind and weary, swam before your mind's eye, followed by the memory of a burning forehead, a ragged breath, and then, stillness. A week ago. The great pestilence. The Red Death. The words had labels in this new memory. This was the plague. And it was here. You tried to grasp your own name, your own past, but it was like clutching smoke. It slipped away, leaving behind only the solid, heavy, terrifying reality of Elara's life. You were a young woman, alone, in a city being consumed from the inside out. The cough shook you again, a painful, barking sound from this strange chest. With monumental effort, you pushed yourself to your feet, your legs trembling beneath you. You had to see. You had to know what world you had been dumped into. Pause here, 5 minutes complete. Part 2, 5 to 10 minutes. The room, Elara's room, was a cell of poverty. Perhaps 10 paces by 8. Besides the straw pallet, there was a 3-legged stool, a large cracked clay pitcher sitting in a shallow basin, the closest thing to a washstand, and a small, iron-bound wooden trunk. The fireplace was cold and empty, not even ashes remained. The chill was pervasive, seeping into your marrow. You took a shaky step, your body moving with an unfamiliar lightness and a disturbing fragility. The rough-hewn plank floor was icy under your bare feet. Your first instinct was to find a mirror, to see the face that now housed your consciousness. There was none. But Elara's memory supplied an alternative. After the rains, water collected in a depression in the cobblestones of the courtyard below your window. You shuffled to the shutter, its wood swollen and warped. Your hands, Elara's hands, did not tremble. This was her domain. From your bodice, you pulled the needle. From a fold of your shawl, you produced a length of strong brown thread you had taken from the kit. Threading the needle was second nature. You began to work, pulling the rough fabric together with small, neat, incredibly precise stitches. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of thread through wool and the distant, lonely cry of a crow. As you worked, focused on the task that felt like a tiny anchor in the chaos, the apothecary spoke. His voice was low, meant only for you. You are not from the houses near the wall. It wasn't a question. You shook your head slightly, not looking up. Seeking a way out, he stated. Your needle paused for a fraction of a second. You gave the slightest nod. The north gate, he murmured. The lenses seemed to scan the empty square. The guard changes at midnight. The new watch, they are weary. They sometimes gather at the brazier to the left of the gate, their backs to the river wall. For 10 minutes, maybe 15, the gate itself is in shadow, watched by no one. You felt a jolt of electric hope so sharp it was painful. You kept stitching. But, he continued, the word dousing that hope with cold water. The woods are not sanctuary. They are full of men who fled earlier. Desperate men. Starving. And the sickness is there too. It walks on the road. It sleeps in the ditches. It is just, thinner on the air. You finished the last stitch, knotted it securely, and bit the thread with your teeth. The repair was invisible unless one looked closely. You looked up at the mask. Thank you. He withdrew his arm, examining the work with a critical, bird-like tilt of his head. He seemed satisfied. He picked up the small clay bottle of vinegar and placed it on the stool beside you. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he took a small, dried sprig of lavender from a bunch and laid it beside the bottle. You had to use both of your new, weaker hands to wrestle a central slat loose, creating a narrow gap. The sight that greeted you stole the breath from your new lungs. It was not a grand medieval vista, but a narrow, muddy alley, hemmed in by leaning, timber-framed buildings whose upper stories almost kissed. The sky above was a uniform, oppressive sheet of dull gray, offering no hint of sun or time. But it was the scene in the alley itself that held you transfixed. A crude cart, little more than a wooden plank on two wheels, stood below. It was draped with a piece of stained, black cloth. Two men, their faces and heads completely swaddled in linen wrappings, exposing only their eyes, were heaving a long, thin bundle onto the cart. The bundle was wrapped in a shroud of cheap, off-white fabric. As one man lifted, a limp, pale hand slipped free from the wrapping, dangling lifelessly. The man shoved it back indifferently with his foot. "Any more?" one of them shouted, his voice muffled by the cloth. "Check the cross door." Your eyes followed his gesture to the house directly opposite. On its stout oak door, painted in a brutal, fresh red, was a large X. Beneath it, in cruder script, were the words, "Lord have mercy. Sickness here." You understood. A quarantined house. No one in, no one out, until all within were dead or miraculously recovered. Your gaze dropped lower, to the ground beneath your window. In a rut worn by cartwheels, a puddle of rainwater had collected, its surface scummed with dirt and oil. It was a dark, imperfect mirror. Driven by a dread you could not name, you leaned out further, ignoring the cold air that bit at your face. The reflection that stared back was a stranger. A woman's face, gaunt and hollow-cheeked. Large, light-colored eyes, blue, gray, were wide with a terror that was both yours and Elara's. The hair was a mess of tangles framing a visage that was young but already worn by grief and hunger. Elara. This was her face. The alley opened onto a slightly wider lane, but it was no less desolate. Here, the signs of abandonment were more explicit. A child's wooden toy, a hobby horse with its paint chipped, lay abandoned in a gutter filled with foul-smelling sludge. A shutter hung from a single hinge, banging intermittently against a wall with a lonely, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. You kept your head down, your eyes scanning ahead and into the dark gaps between buildings. You saw your first living soul not as a person, but as a darting movement. A rat, fat and glossy, scurried across the lane and vanished into a hole in a foundation stone. It moved with a purpose you envied. Then, you saw a person. An old woman, wrapped in so many layers she looked like a pile of rags, was shuffling along the far side of the lane, dragging a small sack behind her. As you drew parallel, she sensed your presence and looked up. Her face was a map of wrinkles and fear. Her eyes, peeking from a woolen wrap, locked onto yours. No words were exchanged. In that brief glance, a whole conversation took place. Are you sick? Are you a threat? Will you steal my sack? Do you have food? You saw her own same questions reflected back at you. She quickly looked away, hunched her shoulders further, and increased her shuffling pace, putting as much distance between you as the lane allowed. Social contract had been reduced to this, mutual terror and isolation. A few paces on, you passed a house where the door stood wide open. From within came the low, persistent buzzing of flies. You knew better than to look inside, but your peripheral vision caught the shape of two forms lying on the floor just beyond the threshold. You averted your eyes, a cold sweat breaking out on your back, and hurried past, the buzzing haunting you for another dozen steps. Your destination was the main conduit that would lead to the market square. As you neared it, you began to hear more signs of a morbid kind of life. You broke off a tiny piece of the cleanish interior. It was dense, sour, and dry as chalk. It stuck in your throat. You reached for the clay pitcher, lifting it with both hands. The water inside was cold and had a flat, mineral taste, with bits of sediment swirling at the bottom. You drank deeply, washing down the miserable bread. It did little to fill the void. Then, your eyes fell on the stool itself. A book. Not a decorated manuscript, but a plain, leather-bound ledger, tucked half underneath. You pulled it out. The pages were filled with neat, sloping script, a man's hand. Tomas's hand. The early pages were household accounts: flour, 2 pence. Salt fish, 1 penny. Candle, halfpenny. A record of a humble, orderly life. As you flipped, the entries grew sparse. Then, they stopped being accounts altogether. The writing changed, becoming a letter. My dearest Elara, the fever burns me. Do not come too close. The priest came today, but I sent him away. His words are empty. Yours are the only prayers I need. The script grew shakier on the next page. I can no longer see the light from the window. I remember it on your hair. Forgive me for leaving you in this dark world. The final entry, on the last page, was barely legible, the letter sprawling and weak: Elara. Live. Do not follow. Just live. The words hit you with a physical force. This was not just a memory, it was a last will, a final charge. Tomas's love for Elara and his terror for her future were etched into the paper. And now, you were the bearer of that charge. You were the one who had to live. The weight of it was crushing. You closed the book gently, holding it to your chest, as if you could absorb some of the courage of the man who wrote it and the woman who received it. The loneliness in the room was no longer just yours, it was a shared, accumulated loneliness, spanning weeks of silent grief. You were not just surviving for yourself. You were surviving for Tomas. For Elara. You had to clear your throat twice before your voice would work, and even then it came out as a dry rasp. Do you have anything? For protection. The mask tilted. The voice that emerged was muffled, metallic, and devoid of warmth. Vinegar. To wash your hands and face. Wormwood, to burn and purify the air. A token of Saint Roch, patron of the plague-stricken. He pointed with a gloved hand. 2 pennies for the vinegar. 3 for the wormwood. 5 for the saint. Your 3 pennies felt pathetic in their hiding place. You had nothing to trade but the clothes on your back and the skill in your fingers. Then you noticed it, a long, fraying tear in the sleeve of his own dark robe, from elbow to wrist. It was a clean rip, as if caught on a nail. A spark of desperate ingenuity flared. You pointed, keeping your arm close to your body. Your sleeve. I can mend that. I am a seamstress. Fine, closed stitches. It will hold. You gestured to the smallest bottle of vinegar. For that. The beaked mask was motionless for what felt like an eternity. You could see your own distorted, tiny reflection in the glass lenses. He was weighing the risk of your proximity against the value of a repaired garment. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. Come. Do it quickly. He gestured to a low stool behind the stall, partially shielded from the square's view. You moved around, maintaining distance until you were seated. He remained standing, holding out his arm, the torn sleeve presented like the limb of a patient to a surgeon. Up close, the smell from his mask was strong, a cloying mix of dried flowers and spices, fighting a losing battle against the pervasive stench of the square. The sob turned into another coughing fit, this one leaving a coppery taste at the back of your throat. You swallowed hard, pushing down the panic. Survival was a primal instinct that overrode existential dread. You had to know your resources. Turning from the window, you began a methodical search of the room, moving with Elara's muscle memory but your own desperate focus. The trunk was the obvious start. Its lid opened with a groan. Inside, folded with a care that spoke of better times, were a few articles of clothing, another dress of the same coarse, undyed wool, threadbare at the elbows, a slightly less frayed shawl, 2 linen shifts, and a pair of crude leather shoes, worn thin at the soles. No jewelry, no trinkets. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft, clean linen, a startling contrast to the surrounding grime, was a small sewing kit, a few bone buttons, a hank of brown thread, a smooth stone for smoothing seams, and 2 fine, sharp needles. Elara's trade. Her skill. A widow's means of scraping a living. You tucked one needle securely into the neckline of your shift, a tiny, sharp secret. Next, you checked the niche Elara's memory hinted at, a loose stone near the floor behind the stool. Prying it out, you found a small cavity. Here was the pantry of the condemned. A cloth bundle contained your food stores, a small, round loaf of bread, hard as rock and sporting a sinister coat of blue-green mold, a wedge of cheese so desiccated it resembled pale wood, and a twist of salt wrapped in parchment. Tied separately in a scrap of leather were 3 thin, worn copper pennies. That was it. The wealth of Elara. It would last a careful woman 3, maybe 4 days. Hunger, a sharp and unfamiliar pang in this smaller stomach, gnawed at you. You picked up the loaf. The mold was extensive. Using your newly acquired needle, you began to meticulously scrape the worst of it off, carving away precious, edible crust. The main door to the street was slightly ajar. Gray light seeped in through the gap. This was it. The threshold. You peered through the crack. The alley was empty now, save for the deep cart ruts and the ominous puddle. The red-crossed door across the way seemed to watch you like a blind, accusing eye. What is your first goal? Your modern mind demanded, seeking a plan. Elara's knowledge supplied fragments. The well for water was in the next square, but it might be contaminated or guarded. The market was to the east. The church for alms to the north. But the market would be a ghost town, and the church would be overwhelmed, its charity stretched to nothing or its doors bolted against the healthy fearing contagion. A new priority surfaced, information. You needed to know the state of the city gates, the movement of guards, the rhythms of the death carts. You needed to hear rumors of escape, of safer quarters, of anything other than this slow extinction. To get that, you needed to be among the few still living and moving. And to do that, you needed a reason to be out that didn't mark you as a desperate fugitive. The sewing. You could be a seamstress looking for work, for trade. It was thin, but it was a story. You pulled the shawl tighter, covering the lower half of your face, leaving only your eyes exposed. With a final glance back into the dark maw of your building, you pushed the door open and stepped into the alley. The cold was immediate and biting, the air a complex poison of smells. You turned east, away from where the death cart had gone, and began to walk, your soft shoes making no sound on the wet stones. You moved close to the walls, a shadow among shadows. Your first foray into the plague-ridden world had begun. A silent, desperate prayer, not to any god but to the collective will of Tomas and Elara, formed in your mind, "Let me live. Let me see one more hour." She moaned but didn't wake. The sharp, clean smell cut through the room's foulness for a moment. You began to hum, a simple, tuneless melody that Elara's body seemed to remember. The father sank to the floor against the opposite wall, his head in his hands, and began to weep silently, his shoulders shaking. You stayed for what felt like an hour, reapplying the vinegar compress, humming, watching the girl's troubled sleep. You were a lifeline in that suffocating room, and for a short while, you forgot you were a prisoner and a fraud. You were just a person trying to soothe a sick child. When the girl's breathing seemed to ease just a fraction, you stood. The father looked up, his eyes red. "I must go," you said softly. "I will. I will try to come back tomorrow." It was a lie born of compassion, a promise you knew you likely couldn't keep. He nodded, too exhausted for words, too grateful to question. As you descended the dark stairs and emerged back into the tannery stench, the gravity of what you'd done settled on you. You had entered a plague house. You had touched a feverish child. The vinegar was for your own protection, but was it enough? A deep, tickling itch began at the very center of your chest, a psychosomatic trigger firing in alarm. You coughed, a dry, harsh sound, and hurried away from that doorway, the memory of the girl's hot forehead imprinted on your fingers like a brand. The cough followed you all the way back to your room. It was no longer just a tickle but a persistent, rasping presence in your lungs, a reminder of the attic's thick air. By the time you barred the door behind you, leaning against it in the familiar gloom, the cough had settled into a deep, grating rhythm. You stumbled to the pitcher, drank deeply, trying to wash away the feeling of contamination. It was during the third or fourth paroxysm that you felt the wetness. You coughed into your hand, a desperate, body-racking effort to clear whatever phantom was in your chest. Distant, echoing shouts that were orders, not conversations, the occasional sharp cry that was cut off too quickly, and once, the heart-wrenching sound of a child wailing, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere before it, too, faded into the general miasma of sorrow. You reached the broader street. It was the closest thing to a main thoroughfare this quarter had. And here, you saw the machinery of the city's siege against itself. A group of 4 men, faces covered, marched with purpose, carrying long hooks and shovels. They turned down an alley, their leader barking, the alderman said the whole lane is to be cleared. Burn the bedding if you must. Further down, a man in a slightly finer, though filthy, tunic stood on a barrel, reading from a scroll to a handful of listless, haunted-looking listeners. And by order of the magistrate, all dogs, cats, and rats are to be killed on sight. Stagnant water is to be removed from yards. Fires of juniper wood are to be lit at crossroads. But your eyes were drawn to the end of the street. There, rising above the rooftops, was the city wall. And set into it was the north gate, a massive arch of reinforced oak and iron, shut fast against the world. Before it stood 2 guards in studded leather jacks, holding long spears. They looked less like vigilant defenders and more like bored jailers, leaning on their weapons, occasionally speaking to each other without enthusiasm. Their presence was an absolute statement: this is a prison. No one enters. No one leaves. The apothecary's whisper about carelessness after midnight seemed a fragile, desperate hope against the solid, grim reality of that sealed gate. A wave of despair threatened to overwhelm you. The scale of your imprisonment was now physically manifest. You were in a walled city, sick and dying, watched by armed men. Your plan to simply walk out was laughable. You needed a better plan, a specific weakness, a moment of chaos. The market square, when you finally entered it, was a monument to absence. It was a vast, open space of packed earth turned to mud, ringed by the skeletal frames of permanent stalls. Their canvas canopies, once bright with stripes and colors, now hung in tatters or were gone entirely, revealing bare poles that reached for the gray sky like the ribs of a dead animal. The central fountain, usually a hub of life and gossip, was dry and filled with trash. The silence here was different from the alleys. It was a hollow, echoing quiet, broken only by the wind whistling through the empty structures. Your eyes scanned the desolation. Then you saw it, a single point of activity. In the very center of the square, a makeshift table had been set up, sheltered by a patched piece of waxed cloth stretched over poles. Behind it stood a figure so tall and thin he seemed to be part of the stall itself. As you approached, the details resolved. He wore a long, dark robe, and over his face, the dreaded symbol of the pestilence, a leather mask with a long, beak-like protrusion. The beak was stuffed, you knew from Elara's memory, with aromatic herbs, lavender, rose petals, camphor, a futile attempt to filter the miasma, the foul air believed to carry the disease. 2 round glass lenses were set into the leather for eyes, giving him the look of some giant, malevolent bird. This was the apothecary, one of the few men whose trade had not collapsed but transformed into a grim parody of itself. On the table before him lay his wares, small, poorly made clay amulets stamped with saints' images, bundles of dried, dusty-looking herbs, chunks of raw brimstone, and rows of small, unlabeled bottles filled with dark, suspicious liquids. There was no one else at his stall. You approached slowly, your heart hammering against your ribs. The masked head turned slightly, the glass lenses fixing on you. You stopped a good 10 feet away, the recommended, safe, distance. He was perhaps in his 30s, but his face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot and wild with a terror that was more immediate than the general atmosphere of dread. "Please, I saw you at the apothecary, you have a kind face. My daughter, she burns. The fever. But she is not marked. No buboes, I swear it. It is just a fever." His grip was desperate. "They will take her if they know. They will mark the door. Can you just sit with her? Just for a little while? Let me rest my eyes. I fear what I might do if I sleep." He was babbling, on the edge of collapse. Elara's memories stirred, images of neighbors helping neighbors, of bringing broth to the sick, of holding a child's hand. The caregiver ward with the survivalist screaming in your modern mind. This is how it starts. You go in, you touch something, you breathe the air, and it's over. But the man's despair was a tangible force, more contagious in that moment than any plague. Against every screaming instinct, you nodded. His relief was so profound he nearly crumpled. He pulled you inside, into a pitch-black hallway and up a narrow, twisting staircase that reeked of mold and urine. The attic room was an oven, the air thick and stale. A small, grimy window provided little light. On a pile of rags in the corner lay a girl of about 7 or 8. Her face was flushed a deep, unnatural red, her hair plastered to her scalp with sweat. Her breathing was quick and shallow. The father was right, you saw no swollen glands on her neck or in her armpits that you could see. But you knew, with a cold certainty from your own time, that the plague could manifest in many ways. This could very well be its beginning. The father hovered, wringing his hands. "Her name is Anya." You knelt, keeping a slight distance. You pulled out your vinegar bottle and your now grimy shawl. Pouring a precious capful of vinegar onto a corner of the cloth, you reached out and gently dabbed it on the girl's burning forehead. There, stark against the dirty lines of your lifeline, was a single, perfect speck of blood. Bright, vibrant red. The world did not tilt so much as it froze. Sound receded. The gray light from the window seemed to sharpen, focusing on that tiny spot of color on your skin. Time fragmented into a series of disjointed thoughts. "It's nothing." You scratched your throat. "The air is foul." The first sign. Cough. Then blood. Then buboes. Then the end. Tomas coughed blood. Elara washed the cloth. The girl in the attic. Her fever. Her breath on your face. You stared at it, this minuscule declaration of war from inside your own body. Was this Elara's destiny finally claiming you? Or was it the consequence of your own reckless compassion? You brought your hand closer to your face. The speck was so small, yet it screamed louder than the death cart bell. With a frantic, almost violent motion, you scrubbed your palm against the rough wool of your skirt. You rubbed until the skin stung and turned red. You held it up to the light. The blood was gone, smeared into nothingness. But the knowledge remained, etched into your mind more permanently than any stain. The plan to escape to the north gate, the apothecary's whispered secret, the vinegar burning in your pouch, it all crumbled to dust in that moment. What was the point of slipping past guards, of braving desperate men in the woods, if you were carrying the seeds of your own death within you? The plague was no longer an external monster lurking in alleyways and behind marked doors. It was here. In your chest. In your blood. A crushing fatigue, deeper than any you had felt since waking, washed over you. It was the fatigue of surrender. You sank onto the straw pallet, drawing your knees to your chest. You watched the sliver of light from the window slowly crawl across the floor, marking the passage of a day you had fought so hard to get through, only to be betrayed by your own flesh. For inside your mask, he grunted. The smell, it helps with the smell of everything else. It was an unexpected kindness, a moment of human recognition in the transactional world of survival. You took the bottle and the lavender, tucking them safely into the fold of your shawl. You stood, nodded once more, and turned to leave. Woman, his muffled voice stopped you. You glanced back. The glass lenses caught the gray light. If you go, go before the new moon. The darker the night, the better your ghost. You absorbed the grim poetry of his advice. A ghost. That's what you needed to become. You slipped away from the stall, back into the labyrinth of empty market lanes, the vinegar bottle cool and solid against your skin, your first tangible tool for survival, and a sliver of a plan taking root in your mind. Pause here, 35 minutes complete. Part 8, 35 to 40 minutes. With the vinegar secured, a new, dangerous curiosity took hold. The apothecary's words had given you a destination, the North Gate, but you needed to scout the route, to understand the neighborhoods between here and there, to find potential hiding spots and dangers. You moved with more purpose now, though no less caution, heading northwest, using the looming city wall as your guide. The architecture changed as you left the commercial heart. The buildings were poorer, leaning together for support, their upper stories jettied out so far they nearly blotted out the gray sky. The stench of tanneries, a mixture of excrement, urine, and rotting flesh, overpowered even the general decay. It was in this warren of despair that it happened. You were passing a doorway that was not quite closed when a hand shot out from the darkness within and clamped around your wrist like a manacle. You stifled a scream, your free hand flying to the needle in your bodice. Please. The voice was a hoarse, broken whisper. A man stumbled out into the dim light. You might have stayed in that stupor of despair until the cart came for you, but the city outside refused to be ignored. The tolling bell, which had become a background drone, was suddenly joined by a new, sharper cacophony, the clash of metal on metal, the stamp of booted feet and authoritative shouts that cut through the general murmur of misery. Driven by a morbid curiosity, you dragged yourself to the window. Below, in the alley, a contingent of the city guard, 6 men in studded leather, helmets on, faces grim behind their nasal bars, had assembled. They looked less weary and more dangerous than the gate guards. One held a hammer and a large nail. Another unrolled a thick parchment scroll. Hear now the order of the magistrate and the council of burghers, the guard with the scroll bellowed, his voice echoing off the close walls. The pestilence spreads by the breath and touch of the afflicted. Henceforth, any person showing signs of fever, cough, or the marks of the plague must be reported to the parish constable. Failure to report is a crime against the public health. He paused, letting the words sink into the silent, shuttered houses. Then he continued, his voice dropping into a colder, more threatening register. The harboring of the sick, whether by kin or neighbor, is hereby deemed an act of willful contagion. Punishable by confinement with the afflicted until such time as God grants mercy or death. A final, brutal nail in the coffin of community. They were criminalizing compassion, turning neighbor against neighbor, family against family. The guard with the hammer slammed the proclamation onto the doorpost of a house at the alley's entrance, the nail striking with a final, definitive thunk. Then, as abruptly as they came, the guards marched away, their boots a rhythmic drum of state-enforced terror. You remained at the window, frozen. The words swirled in your mind. Harboring of the sick, punishable by confinement with the afflicted. New energy, born of pure desperation, flooded your limbs. You quickened your pace, slipping and stumbling, the filthy water splashing into your face. You didn't care. The circle grew larger, resolving into the same barred archway, seen from the inside. You slowed as you neared it. Crouching low in the water, you peered out. The view was of a scrubby field, tall dead grasses, and beyond, the black line of the forest. And there, just 10 paces from the sewer mouth, were 2 more guards. They had their own, smaller fire in a ring of stones. They were sitting on logs, their backs to you, hunched against the cold. You were out of the city, but you were not free. You were in a freezing cesspool, watching the men who stood between you and the woods. You had no choice but to wait. You sank deeper into the water, only your eyes and the top of your head above the surface, hidden in the deep shadow of the archway. The cold became a kind of agony, a burning numbness that crept up your legs and into your core. You clenched your teeth to stop their chattering. Time, once again, became an enemy measured in the gradual loss of feeling in your extremities. You watched the guards, praying for their fire to die, for them to sleep, for any distraction. The woods, so close, felt as unreachable as the moon. You don't know how long you crouched there, turning into a piece of frozen, living stone. The guards talked in low murmurs, occasionally laughing at some bleak joke. One threw another log on their fire, sending up a shower of sparks. The world had narrowed to the circle of their firelight, the dark arch you hid in, and the promising blackness of the trees beyond. Then, salvation came from an unexpected direction, the gate itself. A commotion erupted from the other side. Shouts, the sound of a struggle, a woman's scream, the heavy thud of something hitting the gate from within. "They're trying to rush it," a voice yelled from the wall walk above. The 2 guards by your sewer outlet snapped to attention. Again. "Damn fools," one growled, grabbing his pike. "Come on." They both abandoned their fire and ran along the base of the wall toward the gate, their forms quickly swallowed by the darkness. This was it. Your moment. You didn't think. You acted. Hauling your half-frozen body out of the water, you scrambled up the muddy bank. Your legs were leaden, refusing to obey properly. You fell, then pushed yourself up. You started to run, not toward the woods in a straight line, but at an angle, using the tall, dead grasses for cover, heading for a denser thicket you had spotted. You had covered maybe 20 yards when a shout split the night. "Hey! You there! Halt!" A guard from the wall walk had seen you. You didn't look back. You poured every ounce of will into your legs, your breath coming in ragged, burning sobs behind your mask. You heard the thwack of a crossbow bolt and a simultaneous thud as it buried itself in the trunk of a young tree just to your left, splinter spraying. "Runner!" Outside the wall, the guard bellowed. You zigzagged, a terrified hare. Another bolt whistled past, so close you felt the wind of it. The tree line was there, 50 feet, 30, 10. You threw yourself forward, tumbling through a tangle of brambles that ripped at your dress and skin. You kept rolling, crawling, until you was deep enough into the undergrowth that the light from the guard's fire was just a distant flicker. You collapsed, face down in the leaf litter, your body shuddering with cold, exhaustion, and terror. You listened, every nerve screaming. No sounds of pursuit. No crashing in the brush. The guards, it seemed, had their hands full with the riot at the gate and were not ordered to chase a single, soaked fugitive into the plague-ridden woods. You were out. You were free. And you were possibly dying of cold, but you were outside the walls. At one point, you had to squeeze through a space so narrow you had to turn sideways, the cold, damp stones pressing against your chest and back. Elara's smaller frame was an advantage here. Your path was punctuated by horrors that were now almost routine, yet each one scored another line on your soul. In a tiny courtyard, 3 bodies lay wrapped, awaiting a cart that might not come for days. In another, a starved dog worried at something indistinct in the gloom, growling at you as you passed. You saw a light in a second-story window, a single candle, and heard the unmistakable sound of weeping, a low, hopeless keen that followed you for a block. The geography of Elara's memory guided you, but it was a map from a different time. A bakery she recalled was shuttered and dark. A friendly carpenter's shop was now a hollow shell, its tools looted. You were navigating a corpse, using memories of its living pathways. As you drew closer to the northern quarter, the character of the sounds changed. The death cart bell was fainter, replaced by the rhythmic, distant clash of the guard's watch bell from the walls, and the occasional shouted order. You were entering the city's militarized rim. You reached a point where you could see the north gate again, this time from a different angle. It was even more imposing up close. The doors were massive, reinforced with black iron bands and studs. The wall itself was 30 feet high, slick with damp and moss. The two guards were still there, but as dusk deepened, they lit a small brazier to the left of the gate, its flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows. You saw a third guard descend from the wall walk to join them. They huddled around the warmth, passing a skin between them. Their postures spoke of boredom, cold, and a shared misery. They were men, not monsters. That was your hope. You found your hiding place not in the burnt cottage, but in the deep doorway of a derelict chapel dedicated to some forgotten saint. The father. The man in the attic with the feverish girl, Anya. He was now a criminal. His desperate love for his daughter was now an offense. And you had been in that room. You had touched the girl. If he was discovered, if fear broke him, he might talk. He might describe the kind-faced seamstress who came to help. He might, in his terror to save himself and his child, point the constable to this very building. Your sanctuary was no longer safe. It was a trap. The four walls that had seemed like a prison now felt like a fragile eggshell about to be crushed. The speck of blood on your hand, the new law on the doorpost, they were connected. The city was systematically hunting the sick, and you might now be on both lists, the plagues and the magistrates. Panic, clean and sharp, replaced despair. You could not wait. You could not hide. You had to move. Now. The midnight plan at the north gate was no longer a hopeful gambit for a future, it was an urgent necessity for the coming night. You had hours, not days. You turned from the window, your mind racing, the weight of Tomas's ledger in your trunk seeming to call to you. Live. The command was no longer poignant, it was urgent. A tiny orange flame blossomed, fragile as a flower. You fed it with the smallest twigs, then larger ones, your movements becoming more confident. Soon, you had a small, hot, smokeless fire burning in the root hollow. The feeling that returned to your limbs was painful, 1,000 pins and needles. You stripped off your soaked outer dress and shift, wringing them out and hanging them on branches near the fire to steam. Wrapped in just your shawl, you huddled as close to the flames as you dared, the heat on your skin a divine blessing. You were a primitive thing, naked but for a rag, crouched over a stolen piece of Promethean fire in a vast, uncaring wilderness. But you had made it. You had shelter, warmth, and for this moment, safety. The immensity of the forest around you, which should have felt threatening, felt instead like a protective embrace. It was empty of people, of bells, of death carts. It was full of silence, and for now, that silence was peace. Sleep was a siren call, but you dared not answer. The fire needed tending. The cold was a patient enemy. And the woods, you now realized, were not empty. As your own sounds quieted and your ears adjusted, you began to hear them. Not animals, but people. A muffled sob, carried on the wind from the east. The distinct snap of a twig, too deliberate to be a deer, to the west. A low, agonized moan that seemed to come from the ground itself. The plague had not respected the walls. It had walked out on the backs of those who fled before you. The forest was a refugee camp of the desperate and the dying, this changed things. You couldn't stay here by the oak forever. At first light, you would need to move, to find water, to put more distance between yourself and the city, and between yourself and these other haunted souls. For now, you used the firelight to examine yourself. You checked your arms, your armpits, your neck, your groin, anywhere the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes of the plague, would form. This was the carelessness. This was the gap. But the gate itself was still a problem. It was shut, barred from the inside. Even if you sprinted across the 50 yards of open ground and reached it, you couldn't open it. You needed another way. The sewer. The apothecary's hint about the river wall. The tannery stench was strong here. You let your eyes scan the base of the city wall, away from the gate and the pool of firelight. And there it was, a darker patch in the stone, an arched opening about 3 feet high, barred with a rusted iron grate. A thin trickle of black, viscous liquid seeped from it, cutting a path through the mud before disappearing into a ditch. The city's foul humors, draining away. You watched the guards. Their cluster was tight, their world shrunk to the radius of the brazier's heat. You had to move. Now. Sliding from the chapel doorway, you kept to the deepest shadows along the line of buildings. You moved parallel to the wall, getting closer to the sewer outlet but keeping it between you and the brazier. The ground was muddy and treacherous. You sank ankle-deep once, the cold muck swallowing your foot with a sickening slurp. You froze, heart in your throat, but the guards didn't stir. You reached the wall. The smell from the grate was overpowering, a concentrated essence of every foul thing in the city. Up close, you could see the grate was old, the iron corroded. One of the vertical bars was loose, its bottom anchor pulled partly from the crumbling mortar. You grabbed it with both hands. It was cold and slimy. You pulled, putting all your weight into it. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a screech of metal that sounded catastrophically loud to you, it bent outward, creating a narrow gap just wide enough to squeeze through. The sound echoed in the stone archway. You pressed yourself flat against the wall, not daring to breathe. A guard's voice carried from the brazier. What was that? Rats. Or a cat? You sat on the pallet, forcing yourself to breathe slowly through the vinegar-soaked mask. The plan formed, stark and simple. 1. Leave well before midnight, using the deepening dusk as cover. 2. Navigate to the north gate using back alleys, avoiding the broader streets where guards might patrol. 3. Find the sewer outlet the apothecary had implied existed, a runoff from the tanneries that went under the wall. 4. Wait. Watch the guard change. Look for the moment of inattention, the cluster at the brazier. 5. Move like a shadow. Slip through the gate, or if impossible, try the sewer. 6. Once outside, run for the woods. Keep moving south. The woods had sickness, he said. But they also had space, and streams, and air that wasn't thick with the breath of a dying thousand. You would deal with desperate men and thinner plague when you came to it. Your goal had telescoped down from escape the city to survive the next 12 hours. You were no longer Elara the widow, nor the confused soul from another time. You were a set of instincts, a collection of scavenged tools, and a will to see the dawn from outside these walls. The cough in your chest was a quiet, persistent reminder that the clock was ticking not just on the gate guard's vigilance, but on your own life. Pause here, 55 minutes complete. Part 12, 55 to 60 minutes. You left as the sun began its final surrender, bleeding dusky purple and bruised orange into the gray blanket of cloud. The long shadows of the buildings were not just absence of light, they were pools of potential concealment. You moved like a creature of those shadows, abandoning the main lanes for a maze of service alleys, back passages, and the narrow gaps between buildings where refuse collected. This was the city's hidden anatomy. You passed middens overflowing with waste, their stench eye-watering even through your mask. You climbed over tumble-down fences of wattle and daub, your hands scraping on the rough material. This was the carelessness. This was the gap. But the gate itself was still a problem. It was shut, barred from the inside. Even if you sprinted across the 50 yards of open ground and reached it, you couldn't open it. You needed another way. The sewer. The apothecary's hint about the river wall. The tannery stench was strong here. You let your eyes scan the base of the city wall, away from the gate and the pool of firelight. And there it was, a darker patch in the stone, an arched opening about 3 feet high, barred with a rusted iron grate. A thin trickle of black, viscous liquid seeped from it, cutting a path through the mud before disappearing into a ditch. The city's foul humors, draining away. You watched the guards. Their cluster was tight, their world shrunk to the radius of the brazier's heat. You had to move. Now. Sliding from the chapel doorway, you kept to the deepest shadows along the line of buildings. You moved parallel to the wall, getting closer to the sewer outlet but keeping it between you and the brazier. The ground was muddy and treacherous. You sank ankle-deep once, the cold muck swallowing your foot with a sickening slurp. You froze, heart in your throat, but the guards didn't stir. You reached the wall. The smell from the grate was overpowering, a concentrated essence of every foul thing in the city. Up close, you could see the grate was old, the iron corroded. One of the vertical bars was loose, its bottom anchor pulled partly from the crumbling mortar. You grabbed it with both hands. It was cold and slimy. You pulled, putting all your weight into it. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a screech of metal that sounded catastrophically loud to you, it bent outward, creating a narrow gap just wide enough to squeeze through. The sound echoed in the stone archway. You pressed yourself flat against the wall, not daring to breathe. A guard's voice carried from the brazier. What was that? Rats. Or a cat? The first thing you did, lying there in the freezing leaves, was to peel the vinegar-soaked mask from your face. You sucked in deep, lungfuls of cold, clean air. It was the sweetest thing you had ever tasted. It carried the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, pine, life and death in their natural cycle, not the morbid, human-induced decay of the city. You coughed, a deep, racking cough that brought up phlegm, but, you noted with a desperate hope, no fresh blood. You were free, but you were in dire condition. Soaked to the skin in sewage and river water, your body heat was leaching away at an alarming rate. Hypothermia would kill you as surely as a crossbow bolt. You had to get dry and get warm. Pushing yourself up, you looked around. The woods were dark, but not as pitch black as the sewer. A gibbous moon had risen, casting a weak, silvery light through the bare branches. You could make out shapes. You needed shelter and fuel. You stumbled deeper into the woods, away from the wall, your movements clumsy. You found a massive oak, its roots creating a natural hollow at the base. It would have to do. With numb, fumbling fingers, you opened your bread pouch. The vinegar bottle was intact. The cheese was safe. The needles were there. You also had the flint and steel that had been in Elara's sewing kit, a small, precious tool for starting fires. You gathered what you could find, bone-dry leaves from under the oak, tiny twigs, some strips of bark you peeled from a fallen log. Your hands shook so violently you could barely hold the flint. You struck it again and again against the steel, sending sparks into your tiny pile of tinder. Nothing. Again. A spark caught, glowed red in a leaf, and died. A sob of frustration escaped your lips. You took a breath, forced your hands to steady. You struck again. This time, a spark landed in a perfect nest of dry moss. You saw a tendril of smoke. Gently, so gently, you cupped your hands around it and blew. You sat on the pallet, forcing yourself to breathe slowly through the vinegar-soaked mask. The plan formed, stark and simple. 1. Leave well before midnight, using the deepening dusk as cover. 2. Navigate to the north gate using back alleys, avoiding the broader streets where guards might patrol. 3. Find the sewer outlet the apothecary had implied existed, a runoff from the tanneries that went under the wall. 4. Wait. Watch the guard change. Look for the moment of inattention, the cluster at the brazier. 5. Move like a shadow. Slip through the gate, or if impossible, try the sewer. 6. Once outside, run for the woods. Keep moving south. The woods had sickness, he said. But they also had space, and streams, and air that wasn't thick with the breath of a dying thousand. You would deal with desperate men and thinner plague when you came to it. Your goal had telescoped down from escape the city to survive the next 12 hours. You were no longer Elara the widow, nor the confused soul from another time. You were a set of instincts, a collection of scavenged tools, and a will to see the dawn from outside these walls. The cough in your chest was a quiet, persistent reminder that the clock was ticking not just on the gate guard's vigilance, but on your own life. You left as the sun began its final surrender, bleeding dusky purple and bruised orange into the gray blanket of cloud. The long shadows of the buildings were not just absence of light, they were pools of potential concealment. You moved like a creature of those shadows, abandoning the main lanes for a maze of service alleys, back passages, and the narrow gaps between buildings where refuse collected. This was the city's hidden anatomy. You passed middens overflowing with waste, their stench eye-watering even through your mask. You climbed over tumble-down fences of wattle and daub, your hands scraping on the rough material. Panic was a fire, but it had to be forged into a tool. You could not afford to run blindly into the night. You had hours until midnight, hours to prepare, to think, to become the ghost the apothecary had spoken of. Survival was no longer an abstract concept, it was a checklist. First, you assessed your tools. You laid them out on the stool, the small clay bottle of vinegar, the sprig of lavender, the 3 copper pennies, the 2 needles. It was a pitiful arsenal against a city of death. You tore a long strip from the cleaner of your 2 linen shifts. Soaking it thoroughly with vinegar, you fashioned a mask, tying it securely over your nose and mouth. The sharp, acrid smell was a shock, cutting through the foulness of the room. It stung your eyes, but it was the smell of precaution, of action. You tucked the lavender sprig inside the mask, near your nose. The apothecary was right, its floral scent helped mask the underlying reek of vinegar and decay. The needles. You held one up. It was not a weapon, but it was a precision instrument. It could mend, yes, but it could also pierce, probe, or pick. You slid it back into the hidden spot in your bodice. The other you kept in your hand, its point a tiny, focused threat. Food. You still had the rock-hard cheese and the remains of the bread. You couldn't carry the pitcher. Instead, you emptied the moldy loaf entirely, hollowing it out to create a crude, stiff pouch. Into this, you placed the cheese, the pennies, the vinegar bottle, wrapped in a rag, and the spare needle. You tied the top shut with a thread. It was ugly and impractical, but it kept your hands free. Finally, clothing. You needed to be dark, silent, and able to move. Your dress was a dull, dirty brown, good for blending into shadows. You removed the extra shawl, deciding it was too bulky. You would rely on speed and stealth, not warmth. You checked your shoes, the soles were thin, but they were quiet. You were responsible for him, and that responsibility forced you to think beyond the next meal, to plan for a future. You were no longer a fugitive, you were a guardian making a desperate bid for sanctuary. The next morning, you packed your meager belongings, the now empty bread pouch, used as a general carry-all, the needle and flint, the rabbit skin you'd scraped and were slowly curing. You kicked apart your fire pit and scattered the stones. You took one last look at the lean-to that had been your first taste of security. Then, you took Pip's hand, his smaller, cleaner hand now comfortably tucked in yours, and you walked away from the stream, heading south, guided by the sun and the desperate hope of smoke from a friendly chimney. Pause here, 110 minutes complete. Part 23, 110 to 115 minutes. You traveled for days, keeping to the deep woods but using animal trails and following the general downward slope of the land. You avoided the proper roads, though you sometimes paralleled them from within the tree line, catching glimpses of the hard-packed earth. The forest began to change, the ancient, dense woods gave way to more managed groves and patches of pastureland gone wild. You were entering lands touched by humanity, but not recently. It was on the 4th day of your southward trek that you saw definitive proof you were not in a complete wilderness. You were crouched by a stream, refilling your bottle, when you heard the distinct, rhythmic beat of hooves. You grabbed Pip and pulled him down behind a fallen log. A rider came into view on a road that ran perhaps 50 yards from your hiding place. He was a single man on a lathered, dark horse, riding hard north, back toward the city from which you'd fled. He wore no livery, but his clothes were of good, sturdy wool, and he had a sword at his hip. His face, as he flashed past, was set in a grim, purposeful mask. A messenger. Or a scavenger returning to pick at the carcass of the plague city. 3 days passed in the rhythm of the lean-to. Your snares yielded another rabbit and a surprised, unlucky grouse. You found a patch of wild onions, their sharp green taste a revelation. Pip's cheeks lost their frightening hollows, and he began to shadow you less like a scared ghost and more like an eager, quiet apprentice. He learned to fetch water in the vinegar bottle, to bank the fire, to stay perfectly still when you both heard something in the woods. Your cough persisted, a dry, annoying hack, but it grew no worse. No buboes appeared. The terror of the blood speck receded, replaced by the mundane worry of keeping 2 people fed and sheltered. But a new, larger threat loomed, the weather. The mornings grew colder, with a thick, white frost coating the ground. The wind had a sharper bite. The lean-to, a summer shelter for a lone hunter, would not hold against true autumn rain or winter snow. You needed walls. A roof. A source of food more reliable than luck and snares. You needed to find people. The thought filled you with dread. People meant the risk of the plague, of robbery, of betrayal. But people also meant the possibility of a village, a farm, a monastery, some place with a hearth and stored grain, where a woman and a child might barter labor for shelter through the winter. One evening by the fire, you drew a map in the dirt with a stick. You pointed south. "We need to go this way," you said to Pip. "The city is behind us. The cold is coming. We need to find a village. A place with proper houses." He looked at your crude drawing, then up at you. "Will they let us in?" His voice was small, but the question was piercingly astute. You had no answer. "I don't know," you said honestly. "But we have to try. We can't stay here when the snow comes." He was silent for a moment, then nodded, a single, grave dip of his chin. He trusted your judgment completely. That trust, which had once felt like a chain, now felt like a kind of fuel. You were the woman who had escaped the city of death. You were the woman who had crossed a river of filth and outrun arrows. You were the woman who had turned a needle into a snare and kept a child alive in the wilderness. You had a cough that was slowly, maybe, getting better. The guards at the north gate were a memory. The future was a closed door at the bottom of the hill. You walked toward it, toward the smell of bread and hearth fire, your hand tight around Pip's, ready to knock. The path down was a descent into a different world. The air grew stiller, warmer with the accumulated heat of the cottages and the river's moisture. The sounds became distinct, the cluck of chickens settling for the night, the low of a cow from the common herd, the distant ring of a hammer on metal from a smithy shutting down. Normal sounds. Terrifying in their normalcy. You approached the first cottage on the outskirts. It had a small, neat garden, now harvested down to brown stalks. A curl of smoke rose from its chimney. Light flickered in a small, horn-pane window. Your heart hammered against your ribs. This was the moment. Do you knock here? Do you go to the church? Do you find the village elder? Before you could decide, the cottage door opened. A man stepped out, middle-aged with a broad, weathered face and thick arms. He was carrying an armful of firewood. He saw you instantly, freezing in his tracks. His eyes went wide, then narrowed, scanning you and Pip with a look that was not fear, but a deep, weary caution. He didn't speak. You stopped, pulling Pip slightly behind you. You lowered your shawl from your face, showing you were not trying to hide. Good evening, you said, your voice rough from disuse and the cold air. He didn't return the greeting. Where'd you come from? He asked, his voice flat. The north, you said, which was truth enough, the city. The word was loaded with dread. You hesitated, then nodded. We left, before the worst. Another half-truth. You spent the morning on a new project. You found a young, supple sapling and, using your needle to gouge and scrape, you managed to cut a length of it. You bent it into a crude, powerful spring. You used your remaining thread, braiding it to make it stronger, to fashion a noose and a trigger mechanism. It was clumsy, born of theory rather than practice, but it was a snare. You set it along a faint animal trail you found near the stream, disguising the noose with leaves. Pip watched the entire process, fascinated. When you were done, you showed him how it worked, gently triggering it with a stick. His eyes went wide with understanding. For rabbits, he whispered, his first voluntary communication. For rabbits, you confirmed, a spark of shared purpose igniting between you. The wait was agonizing. You occupied the time by improving the lean-to, gathering a large store of firewood, and teaching Pip how to spot the driest tinder. You returned to the snare at dusk, hope a fragile flutter in your chest. The first two were untouched. Despair began to creep in. Then, you approached the third. There was movement. The sapling was bent, trembling. And in the noose, kicking feebly, was a fat, gray rabbit. A surge of emotion so raw it was blinding hit you, triumph, relief, a savage pride. You had provided. You killed the rabbit quickly and cleanly with a sharp rock, an act that felt strangely sacred rather than violent. That night, you cooked the meat on sharpened sticks over the fire. The smell of roasting meat was the most beautiful, profound aroma you had ever experienced. You gave the first and largest piece to Pip. He took it reverently, burning his fingers in his eagerness, and ate with a single-minded intensity that brought a lump to your throat. Then you ate, the hot, greasy, gamey flesh tasting like a feast for kings. For the first time since waking in Elara's body, you did not go to sleep with hunger gnawing at your insides. You had turned a needle and thread sentence. His eyes went to Pip, peeking from behind your skirt. Your boy. I'm his guardian, you said, the word feeling right. His family is gone. The man's stern expression softened, just a fraction. The universal tragedy. He looked you both up and down, your ragged dress, Pip's bare, scarred feet, the general look of people who had been sleeping in leaves. The pestilence, he said, not a question. Did you bring it? This was the crucial question. You met his gaze. We have no fever. No marks. We've been in the woods for many days. We are clean. You said it with as much conviction as you could muster, praying the cough that had plagued you would not choose this moment to return. He was silent for a long moment, weighing. He looked past you, up the path to the woods, as if checking for others. We lost near half our people to the summer fever, he said, his voice low. We buried the last of them a month ago. We're clean now. We mean to stay that way. Your hope, so briefly kindled, began to gutter. This was it. The rejection. The door closing. But, he said, sighing heavily, a sound of a man burdened by decisions. We are Christian folk. And that is a child. He nodded toward Pip. You can't stay in the woods with winter coming. Wait here. He dropped the firewood by his door and disappeared inside. You stood frozen, holding Pip's hand tightly. Was he getting a weapon? Calling others? After a minute, he returned. In one hand was a rough wool blanket. In the other, a half loaf of dark bread. He held them out, not coming closer. The old shepherd's hut, he said, nodding up the valley, away from the clustered homes. By the birch copse, near the river. It's sound. No one uses it since old Said died. You can stay there tonight. In the morning, we'll see. Keep to yourselves. If you sicken, you leave. No argument. It wasn't welcome. It was quarantine. But it was a roof. It was a chance. You took the bread and the blanket, your hands trembling. He just stared, his breath hitching in silent sobs. Plague orphan. The story was written in his solitary state, his night clothes, his terror. He had likely fled a dead household, or been abandoned. He had been out here, alone, for who knew how long. Your hand went to your bread pouch. You broke off the smallest corner of your precious, rock-hard cheese. You placed it on a cleanish leaf and nudged it closer to him with a stick. He stared at it, then at you, suspicion and desperate hunger warring on his dirty face. Hunger won. He snatched the cheese and shoved it into his mouth, chewing frantically. The act of feeding him decided it. You couldn't leave him. The part of you that had decided to survive, the part that carried Tomasa's final command, understood that survival had to mean something. It couldn't just be the preservation of your own skin at the cost of everything else. That was the law of the city you had escaped. Come, you said, standing slowly. It's not safe here. We need to find a better place. He didn't move, just watched you with those huge, unsure eyes. You held out your hand, palm up, non-threatening. It was a long, silent minute. Then, with an effort that seemed to cost him dearly, he uncurled his body and crawled out from under the bush. He stood on wobbly legs, but made no move to take your hand. He simply stood there, a tiny, ragged statue of misery, waiting for you to lead. You had escaped the city only to chain yourself to its most vulnerable cast-off. The weight of the decision was immense, but as you turned and began to walk, you heard the soft, stumbling patter of his bare feet following behind you. The burden was terrifying, but it was also, in a way you couldn't yet articulate, the first real thing you had chosen for yourself in this new life. Walking with the boy, you learned his name was Pip from a single, whispered syllable, was a study in slowed pace and heightened vigilance. You focused on the immediate tasks, ensuring the fire would last, making the lean-to as weatherproof as possible with piles of leaves, checking your meager supplies. You had the cheese, nearly gone. You had the needle. You had the empty vinegar bottle, which you could now use to carry water. And you had Pip. The equation of survival had become infinitely more complex. As full dark fell, you sat with your back against the rock, and Pip, overcome by exhaustion, curled up on his side, his head eventually coming to rest against your leg. You sat very still, not wanting to disturb him. The firelight danced on his dirty, peaceful face. This tiny, fragile trust was a heavier responsibility than any you had faced, heavier than navigating sewers, heavier than outrunning arrows. It was the weight of a future, however uncertain. You wrapped your shawl around his shoulders and prepared for another long, watchful night. With the dawn of a new day in the woods came the most pressing problem, food. Your cheese was a memory. You had nothing to give Pip, and your own hunger was a sharp, nagging presence. You had no weapons to hunt, no knowledge of edible plants in this medieval forest beyond the obvious, and out of season, berries. But you had your needle, and you had thread. While Pip slept, you sat by the cold ashes of the fire and thought. Elara's skill was with a needle. Could that skill translate to hunting? You remembered reading about primitive snares. You had strong thread. You had your knife-sharp needle to shape wood. He was a reminder that the world outside still had order, communication, law, concepts that felt alien to you now. You were an outlaw, a plague refugee with a child who was not yours, existing in the cracks between that ordered world. You watched him disappear in a cloud of dust, a knot of anxiety tightening in your stomach. What story could you possibly tell that would grant you mercy in that world? That you were a widow fleeing the pestilence. They would fear you carried it. That the child was your son. They might not believe you. That you were just travelers. From where? No answers felt safe. Later that afternoon, Pip's stamina, which had grown, finally flagged. I'm tired, he said, simply stating a fact. Without a word, you knelt and lifted him onto your back. He wrapped his thin arms around your neck, his head resting on your shoulder. The physical burden was grounding. It was real, manageable. It distracted you from the larger, more terrifying questions of what lay ahead. You walked on, your steps slower but determined, Pip's even breath warm against your neck. The destination was a mystery, but the act of moving forward, of carrying this small life towards some semblance of safety, had become the entire point of your existence. You were no longer running from something, you were walking towards something, however vague. And that made all the difference. The light was failing on what felt like the 7th day since leaving the lean-to. The cold was deeper now, promising frost. You were considering finding a sheltered nook for the night when you smelled it. It was not the smell of decay. It was the smell of hope. Wood smoke. Not the acrid, choking smoke of burning plague victims, but the sweet, earthy, peat-scented smoke of hearth fires, many of them. You stopped, Pip sliding from your back. You both stood still, noses lifted to the wind like animals. Moving with a caution born of new knowledge about your unseen neighbors, you began to descend a gentle slope. The forest was ancient, with thick stands of pine and bare-branched oaks. The ground was a thick carpet of fallen needles and leaves, muffling your steps. After perhaps an hour of walking, you heard it, the faint, musical trickle of running water. You found a small stream, clear and cold, cutting a path through a rocky bed. You fell to your knees beside it, ignoring the cold, and drank deeply, cupping the water in your hands. It was clean, tasting of minerals and earth. It was life itself. You drank until your stomach felt full and sloshy. Then, you looked at your reflection. The face in the stream was a shock. It was Elara's face, but transformed. Gaunt to the point of skull-like, smudged with soot and dirt from the fire and the sewer. But the eyes that had been wide with terror in the city puddle were different. They were still fearful, but the fear had been honed into a sharp, feral alertness. The passivity of the grieving widow was gone, burned away in the desperate flight. This was the face of a survivor. You splashed water on your skin, using your hands to scrub away the worst of the grime, the vinegar long gone. The cold was bracing, shocking you fully awake. You stood, surveying your surroundings. You were in a shallow valley. The city wall was nowhere in sight. You were truly free of it. The woods stretched in every direction, vast and unknown. You had a small piece of cheese, a needle, a flint, and the clothes on your back. You had no destination, only a direction, away. South, where the apothecary had said the sickness was thinner, where maybe, just maybe, life persisted in something resembling normalcy. You took one last look at your reflection, this new, wilder version of yourself, and turned your back on the stream. You had a purpose now, to put one foot in front of the other, to find food, to avoid other people. You moved at the speed of his short, bleeding legs, stopping frequently when he stumbled. You found yourself scanning the woods not just for threats to yourself, but for threats to him. Your world, which had briefly expanded to the horizon, contracted again to the few feet of forest floor between the two of you. Your goal was no longer just putting distance between you and the city, it was finding shelter for the night for two. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting long, cold shadows, you found it, a hunter's lean-to, half collapsed against a rocky outcrop. It was little more than a slanted roof of rotting branches and mud, but it was a windbreak and would conceal a small fire. It would have to do. You set Pip down on a relatively dry patch of ground inside. Stay here. Don't make a sound. He nodded, his eyes wide. You gathered firewood, a tedious process now, as you couldn't venture far. You showed him how to collect the driest, smallest twigs, making it a quiet game. He watched, imitating you with a solemn focus that was heartbreaking. You built the fire in the mouth of the lean-to, using your flint. This time, your hands were steadier. The flame caught quickly. As the warmth began to radiate, Pip inched closer, holding his small, grimy hands out to the heat. You saw him relax, just a fraction. The terror in his eyes banked to a watchful wariness. It was then that the cough returned. It had been a background presence, but now, in the quiet of the makeshift camp, it erupted, a wet, deep rattle that bent you double. You turned away from Pip, coughing into the crook of your elbow, into your shawl. When it passed, you carefully checked the fabric. No new blood. Just clear phlegm. You let out a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. Perhaps the clean air was helping. Perhaps the speck had been a fluke. You looked at Pip, who was staring at you with that unnerving, quiet observation. You gave him a weak smile. It's all right. Just a cough. You had been walking for perhaps another hour, your senses tuned to the forest sounds, when a new noise broke the pattern. It was not the wind, nor an animal. It was a human sound, a child's whimper, thin and exhausted, like the last squeak of a wounded bird. Every survival instinct screamed at you to turn away, to melt into the trees. A child meant people, and people meant danger, disease, or demands you couldn't meet. But the sound was so small, so utterly defeated, that it bypassed your caution and hooked directly into a deeper, more primal part of you, the part that was still Elara, the caregiver, the part that remembered the feverish girl in the attic. Against your better judgment, you followed the sound. It led you to a dense thicket of brambles and young saplings. Peering through the tangled branches, you saw him. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. He was curled into a tight ball under the dubious shelter of a thorny bush, wearing only a thin, ragged linen nightshirt, now filthy and torn. His feet, poking out, were bare, crusted with dried blood and dirt from countless scratches. He was shivering violently, his face buried in his arms. You froze, the conflict within you paralyzing. He's a burden. He'll slow you down. He'll cry and give away your position. He might be sick. The arguments were logical, cold, and irrefutable. But as you watched the tiny, shuddering form, another memory surfaced, not Elara's this time, but your own, a universal fragment of what it meant to be small, scared, and utterly alone in a vast, terrifying world. You took a slow, careful step forward, trying not to startle him. The rustle of leaves made him flinch. He uncurled slightly, one huge, terrified eye peeking out from under his arm. It was the eye of a trapped animal. "Shoo," you said, your voice soft, lower than Elara's usual tone. "I won't hurt you." You knelt, still keeping a safe distance. "Where is your family?" You were responsible for him, and that responsibility forced you to think beyond the next meal, to plan for a future. You were no longer a fugitive, you were a guardian making a desperate bid for sanctuary. The next morning, you packed your meager belongings, the now empty bread pouch, used as a general carry-all, the needle and flint, the rabbit skin you'd scraped and were slowly curing. You kicked apart your fire pit and scattered the stones. You took one last look at the lean-to that had been your first taste of security. Then, you took Pip's hand, his smaller, cleaner hand now comfortably tucked in yours, and you walked away from the stream, heading south, guided by the sun and the desperate hope of smoke from a friendly chimney. You traveled for days, keeping to the deep woods but using animal trails and following the general downward slope of the land. You avoided the proper roads, though you sometimes paralleled them from within the tree line, catching glimpses of the hard-packed earth. The forest began to change, the ancient, dense woods gave way to more managed groves and patches of pastureland gone wild. You were entering lands touched by humanity, but not recently. It was on the 4th day of your southward trek that you saw definitive proof you were not in a complete wilderness. You were crouched by a stream, refilling your bottle, when you heard the distinct, rhythmic beat of hooves. You grabbed Pip and pulled him down behind a fallen log. A rider came into view on a road that ran perhaps 50 yards from your hiding place. He was a single man on a lathered, dark horse, riding hard north, back toward the city from which you'd fled. He wore no livery, but his clothes were of good, sturdy wool, and he had a sword at his hip. His face, as he flashed past, was set in a grim, purposeful mask. A messenger. Or a scavenger returning to pick at the carcass of the plague city. You crept to the edge of the tree line, pushing aside a final screen of bare branches. Below you, nestled in a gentle river valley, lay a village. A proper village. A dozen or so cottages with walls of wattle and daub and steep thatched roofs clustered around a central green. A stone church with a stubby spire stood at one end. And from at least half of the chimneys, thin, steady plumes of grey smoke rose into the twilight air, straight and true. It was alive. It was functioning. There were no red crosses on any doors. No piles of bodies. No eerie silence. You saw a woman, a shawl around her shoulders, hurry from a cottage to a barn, a bucket in her hand. An old man sat on a bench outside another, simply staring at the gathering dusk. A dog barked somewhere. It was a snapshot of normalcy so profound it brought tears to your eyes. But it was also a fortress. How would they view strangers? Especially now. The sight of the messenger proved news of the plague had spread. They would be fearful, insular. This was it. The end of the wilderness. The beginning of something else. Sanctuary or sentence. You knelt in front of Pip, taking his small, cold hands in yours. His face was smudged, his clothes ragged, but his eyes were clear. "We are going down there," you said, your voice low and serious. "You must be very, very quiet. Do not speak unless I tell you to. Stay close to me. Let me do the talking." You had no plan, no lie prepared. You had only need, and the raw truth of your struggle. He nodded, his trust in you absolute. You took a deep breath, the smell of hearth smoke filling your lungs, the smell of bread baking, of stew simmering, of families gathered safely from the cold. You stood up, brushed the leaves from your dress, and smoothed Pip's wild hair as best you could. Then, you took his hand. Together, you stepped out of the tree line and onto a well-worn path that led down into the valley. You were no longer just Elara, and no longer just a displaced soul. "Thank you," you whispered, the words thick with emotion. He just grunted, his face unreadable. "Go on now. Before full dark." He turned and went back inside, closing the door firmly. You heard the sound of a bar sliding home. You stood for a second in the gathering dusk, the bread and blanket in your arms. Then, you turned and led Pip up the path, away from the cottages, toward the birch trees he had indicated. You had been given a fragile thread of grace. A night's shelter. A tomorrow that was uncertain, but not hopeless. It was more than you had dared to pray for. The shepherd's hut was exactly as described, a small, sturdy structure of stone and turf, built into the side of a hill near a chuckling stream. Its door was a simple wooden slab, unlocked. You pushed it open. The interior was one room, dark and smelling of earth, old wool, and wood smoke. There was a crude fireplace with a cold hearth, a pile of dry peat bricks stacked beside it, a narrow sleeping platform heaped with musty straw, and a single three-legged stool. It was paradise. You got a fire going quickly, the peat bricks catching with a low, fragrant flame that filled the hut with a gentle, drowsy warmth. You spread the blanket on the straw platform and gave Pip the bread. He ate it slowly, savoring each bite, while you used your bottle to fetch water from the stream, sitting on the stool by the fire, watching Pip finally fall into a deep, secure sleep on the actual bed. You felt a wave of exhaustion so complete it was euphoric. You were under a solid roof. You had a constant source of water. You had warmth. The immediate, screaming needs of survival had been answered, if only temporarily, but your mind, now freed from those urgencies, began to race ahead to the morning. "We'll see," the villager had said. What did that mean? Would the elder come? Would they demand you leave? Would they offer work? What could you offer? You were a seamstress, but did a struggling village need fine stitches? Auric's eyes took in everything, your clean but ragged state, Pip's attentive silence, the lack of any signs of sickness. You claim to be clean of the pestilence. You understand we must be sure. For our own families. I understand, you said. We have been alone in the woods for over a week. We have no fever. You willed yourself not to cough. He looked at the man from the cottage. Gawain here says you have skill with a needle. That you mended his sleeve from a distance yesterday while talking. Gawain, you now had a name, gave a short nod. It is true. I was a seamstress. We have little need for fine embroidery, Auric said bluntly. I can mend, you said quickly. Sails, nets, cloaks, shoes. I can tan the hide of the animals I catch. I can gather, tend a garden, cook, care for children or the elderly. You were listing every skill you could think of, Elara's and your own combined. That he looked at Pip. And the boy? He is quick. He learns. He can gather firewood, tend animals, fetch water. He is no trouble. You put a hand on Pip's shoulder. Auric was silent for a long time, his gaze moving between you. The silence stretched, filled only with the morning birdsong. Finally, he sighed, a sound of a man making a decision against his better judgment. The fever took many of our women and children. We have fields that need weeding before the frost sets hard, wool to card and spin for winter, nets to mend for the river fish. The hut is yours for the winter, if you work. Your labor for the roof over your head and a share of the common store. The boy will help where he can. He held up a finger, his eyes turning hard. But mark this, you stay apart until the full moon has passed. No one comes here but Gawain, who will bring you tasks and food. If either of you shows so much as a sniffle, you leave that same hour. No pleading. Do you agree? It was probation. It was isolation. It was a chance. Your heart soared. Yes, you said, your voice firm. We agree. Thank you. The other women were initially silent around you, but as your hands proved capable and you kept your head down, they began to talk amongst themselves, and eventually, to include you in the practical talk of patterns, dyes, and the coming winter. Pip, you learned at the end of the day, had spent his time with the village children, a shy but willing participant in their chores. He came back to the hut with a smudge of dirt on his nose and a quiet excitement in his eyes. That night, as you sat in your hut, you realized something had shifted. You were no longer the woman from the city. You were the new weaver, or Pip's guardian. You had an identity, however small, within the social fabric. You had been given a thread, and you had woven yourself in. The work was hard, the life was simple and poor beyond anything your old self could have imagined. But it had structure. It had safety. It had a future that extended beyond the next sunrise. You had a child to raise, a skill to hone, a community that, while not warm, was beginning to accept your presence. The weight of Tomasa's command, live, no longer felt like a desperate burden. It felt like a daily practice. You were living. Not just breathing, but building, contributing, caring. One evening, you took out the ledger, Tomasa's book. You opened it to the last page. Live. Do not follow. Just live. You touched the faded ink. We are, Tomas, you whispered to the empty hut. Elara and I, we are living. You closed the book. The past was a closed room. The future was a blanket on the loom, its pattern emerging one thread at a time. For the first time, you looked toward that future not with dread, but with a weary, hard-won hope. Winter closed its fist on the valley. Snow fell, thick and silent, blanketing the hut, the village, the woods beyond in a pristine white. Auric nodded, once. Gawain will bring you wool to card today and a net to mend. We'll see the quality of your work. With that, he turned and walked back toward the village. Gawain gave you another unreadable look, then followed. You closed the door and leaned against it, a tremulous smile breaking across your face. You looked at Pip. We have a home, you whispered. And we have work. It was not freedom, not yet. It was indentured survival. But it was a place in the world. It was a beginning. The rhythm of the next few weeks was one of isolated industry. Gawain came each morning, leaving raw wool, a torn fishing net, or a bundle of herbs to be sorted and dried. He collected the finished work from the previous day, inspected it with a critical eye, and left a small parcel of food, a bit of pottage, some hard bread, occasionally a strip of dried fish or a turnip. He rarely spoke, but his inspections grew less suspicious, his nods of approval slightly more pronounced. You worked from dawn until dusk. Carding wool was a tedious, arm-aching business, but you fell into its mindless rhythm. Mending nets was intricate, familiar work for your needle-wielding hands. Pip proved his worth, gathering an impressive pile of dry kindling each day, fetching water, and even helping to comb the snarls from the raw wool with his small fingers. The cough that had haunted you gradually faded, disappearing entirely by the time the first hard frost silvered the grass. No buboes ever appeared. The terror of the blood speck receded into the past, a nightmare from another life. You were healthy. You were strong. The isolation was strange. You could see the village in the distance, smoke rising, people moving about their business. You could hear the occasional shout, the bark of a dog, the bell from the church. You were so close to community, yet utterly separate from it. It was a constant reminder of your precarious position. You were a potential threat being slowly, cautiously vetted. The world became small and quiet, reduced to the journey between hut and weaving house, the circle of firelight, the sound of Pip's voice learning a new song from the village children. One bitterly cold afternoon, a figure trudged through the snow to your hut. It was Alric. He stomped the snow from his boots and entered without ceremony, accepting a cup of hot water from the hearth. "The winter is hard," he said, staring into the fire. Old Meg took a fall. Her hands shake too much to spin now. She has a lifetime of skill, but her thread breaks. He looked at you. "Gawain says your stitches are the finest he's seen. Could you sit with her? Your hands for her knowledge. She can teach you the spinning of fine thread, the dyes we use. It is valuable knowledge." It was not just an assignment. It was an offer of apprenticeship. Of passing on something precious. Of truly becoming part of the village's continuum. You felt a swell of emotion you couldn't name. "I would be honored," you said. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. Start tomorrow." He finished his water and stood to leave. At the door, he paused, not looking back. The boy, he should learn his letters properly. "Come spring, when the priest visits, I will speak to him." Then he was gone, leaving you standing in the middle of your humble home, stunned. Apprenticeship. Education for Pip. These were not just means of survival, they were investments in a future within this community. That night, you sat with Pip by the fire. The rabbit-skin blanket was now complete, warm around your shoulders. You were working on a new project, a small shirt for Pip, from the woven cloth you had helped make. "Pip," you said. He looked up from where he was trying to whittle a piece of wood with your blunt knife. "In the spring, you might go to the priest to learn more letters. To read." His eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes. And I am to learn from old Meg. To spin and dye." But in the hut, with Pip, a quiet domesticity took root. You taught him letters in the dirt with a stick, using the Latin alphabet you remembered and the common words Elara knew. He learned with a frightening quickness. You told him stories, fairy tales from your world, sanitized and adapted, and simple stories of Tomas and Elara's life before the plague. He listened, rapt. In the evenings, by the peat fire, you would work on curing the rabbit skins from your snares, which you still set, with Gawain's tacit permission, slowly sewing them together to make a warmer blanket for the coming deep cold. You were no longer just surviving hour to hour. You were building a skill set, a reputation for reliability, a bond with the child in your care, a tiny store of security, the hidden pennies, the needle, the growing fur blanket. The frantic, sharp-edged fear of the city was gone, replaced by a steady, watchful determination. You were earning your place, stitch by stitch, task by task. The ghost of the plague city was fading, and in its place stood a woman who was, against all odds, making a life. The full moon came and went. The morning after, Gawain arrived not with a task, but with Alric. The elder looked you and Pip over once more, his gaze clinical. "No sickness," he stated. "No, sir," you replied. He nodded. "The women at the weaving house need an extra hand. The nets you mended held well. You will go with Gawain today. The boy can help in the byre with the children, gathering eggs and watching the geese." It was a promotion. It was integration. Your probation was over. That day, you walked into the village proper for the first time. Eyes watched you from doorways and windows, but the looks were more curious than hostile. The weaving house was a long, low building filled with the clack of looms and the chatter of women. You were put to work on a simple loom, weaving coarse wool into blanket fabric. You could set snares, gather, tend a fire. You were strong, or you were becoming strong. And Pip. He was your strongest argument and your greatest vulnerability. A child needed care. A child represented a future for a village that had lost so many. But a child also needed food, clothing, shelter, a drain on scarce resources. You banked the fire and lay down next to Pip, pulling part of the blanket over you. The hut was silent save for the crackle of peat and the stream outside. For the first time since waking in Elara's body, you were safe, dry, warm, and fed. The simplicity of it was almost shocking. You stared at the shadows dancing on the low ceiling, your mind a whirl of fear and fragile hope. Tomorrow, you would have to prove your worth. Tomorrow, you would have to step back into the world of people, with all its complexities and dangers. But for tonight, you allowed yourself the luxury of stillness, of safety. You listened to Pip's steady breathing, and for the first time, you felt not like a ghost or a fugitive, but like a person on the threshold of a life. It was terrifying. It was everything. The morning came bright and cold. You woke to the sound of Pip already awake, sitting quietly and poking at the embers of the fire with a stick. You shared the last of the bread from the night before. The question of the day hung heavy in the air. It was answered by a knock on the door just after sunrise. Not a fearful rap, but a firm, solid thump. You opened it to find two men. The first was the man from the cottage, his expression still cautious. The second was older, with a long, grey beard and intelligent, tired eyes. He wore a simple wool tunic but carried a staff of office, the village elder or headman. "I am Alric," the older man said, his voice calm but leaving no room for nonsense. "You spent the night well?" "Yes." "Thank you," you said, stepping aside to let them see the tidy hut, the sleeping Pip. "We are grateful for the shelter. The damn things are everywhere. Ugh. This place stinks." You waited, counting 10 heartbeats. No one came. Taking a final, desperate gulp of the marginally cleaner air outside, you dropped to your hands and knees. The gap was a mouth of darkness, exhaling a freezing, putrid breath. You closed your eyes, thought of Tomasa's final word, live, and pushed yourself headfirst into the river of filth. The shock was total. The water was icy, a cold so intense it stole your breath and screamed up your nerves. It was not water, but a viscous, silty slurry that came up to your waist as you landed. The darkness was absolute, a weight pressing on your eyes. The smell was indescribable, a solid, tangible presence of human waste, rotting matter, and chemical runoff from the tanneries. Your vinegar mask was useless against it. You retched, vomiting the meager bread you'd eaten into the stream. You had to move. The exit was behind you. Freedom was ahead. You turned, feeling the slimy, curved wall of the tunnel with your hands. It was narrow, you could touch both sides without fully extending your arms. The ceiling was just above your head. You began to shuffle forward, one hand on the wall for guidance, the other holding your bread pouch above the water. Your feet slipped on the uneven, sludgy bottom. Things bumped against your legs, soft, unidentifiable things. You tried not to think about them. The only orientation was the faint, gray light of the exit behind you, which slowly shrank to a distant coin. Ahead was pure black. You moved by braille and faith, step by agonizing step. The cold was leeching your strength, your muscles beginning to tremble violently. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, a literal descent into the underworld. Then, you saw it. Far ahead, a different shade of black, a less absolute darkness. It had a shape, a circle. The exit on the other side of the wall. "That's good," he said, with simple conviction. Then he went back to his whittling. You watched him, the firelight gilding his profile. You thought of the long, terrible journey from the stone room to this warm hut. The death cart, the apothecary's mask, the freezing sewer, the lonely woods. You thought of the blood speck, the fear that had nearly broken you. You thought of the trust in this child's eyes, and the grudging respect in Alric's. You were not the person who had woken up in that room. That person had been erased, overwritten by terror and necessity. You were not quite Elara either, though her skills and memories lived in your hands. You were something new, forged in filth and fear, tempered by kindness and relentless work. A weaver. A guardian. A survivor. The cough was gone. The city was a dark smear on the northern horizon of your mind. The future was a spinning wheel waiting to be learned, a child's education, a community that had, in its own slow, cautious way, taken you in. You looked at your hands, Elara's hands, now also yours. They were chapped and calloused, but they were strong. They could mend a net, card wool, set a snare, soothe a child's brow. They could build a life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the past, blessing the present, sealing in the quiet promise of the future. Inside, the fire crackled, and the needle in your hand moved with a steady, confident rhythm, pulling thread through fabric, weaving your story into the long, unbroken tapestry of the living.